So welcome, good evening, buonasera, buenas noches. The Vito Marc Antonio Forum welcomes you to another edition of our author series. Tonight we'll be featuring War Against All Puerto Ricans by Nelson Denis, as well as two dramatizations by Roberto Aragone of Vito Marc Antonio's congressional speeches about Puerto Rico. Thank you. Can everyone hear me, or do you know I need to use a microphone? So my name is Gil Fagiani, and I'm going to be your chairperson this evening. First, I would like everyone to please turn off all their cell phones and other electronic devices. The Vito Marc Antonio Forum is an historical, cultural, and educational organization that brings together people from a wide variety of backgrounds interested in sharing knowledge of the life and work of Congressman Vito Marc Antonio. A protege of Fiorello LaGuardia, Marcantonio was the most electorally successful radical American politician of the 20th century. He served as a congressman from East Harlem for 14 years, 1934 to 36, and 1938 to 1950. Critical to his success was his unique multi-ethnic coalition of Italians, Puerto Ricans, and African Americans. Today's presentation marks the Vito Marc Antonio's, I think, what, 19th or 20th? 20th, right. 20th public event since it was reconstituted on October 11th, 2011. So I'm going to talk a little about some of the activities we've done in the past, which included a celebration of the 4th printing of Professor Gerald Meyer's book, Vito Marc Antonio, Radical Politician, 1902 to 1954, which was in October of 2011 at the Brecht Forum. There have been, I think there's now 3 or 4 full biographies of Marc Antonio, and I certainly feel that Jerry's is the most comprehensive. A special tribute to Vito Marc Antonio and the Puerto Rican people, Solidarity and Progress, on November 28, 2012, was attended by more than 100 people at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. On February 22nd, in 2014, at this venue, the Vito Marc Antonio Forum presented a book party with dramatic readings and discussion of The Heart is the Teacher by Leonard Covello, who was a teacher, an educational theorist, a long-term East Harlem resident, activist, and one of the most important historical figures in the Italian-American community in the 20th century. On May 10, 2014, along with the Italian American Writers Association, we sponsored a book lecture with slides here of Simone Cinotto's The Italian American Table, Food, Family, and Community in New York City. On August 9, 2014, on the 60th anniversary of Vito Marc Antonio's death, 70 people gathered at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx to celebrate his life. To further honor his memory, Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz and New York City Council member and Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito attended and sponsored a proclamation naming August 9th as Vito Marc Antonio Day in the Bronx. They also promised to work with the forum to name a street after Vito Marc Antonio. In celebration of Black History Month, the Vito Marc Antonio Forum sponsored a talk, East Harlem's African American Community, by Chris Bell. You want to wave? There's Chris. He's here today with us. Author of East Harlem Remembered, Oral Histories of Community and Diversity, at the same venue. And I believe you have how many books published about East Harlem?
3.
3.
I got 1 here today.
Okay, very good. And at the Mulberry Street Library on May 4th of last year, in celebration of Labor History Month, the Vito Marc Antonio Forum sponsored a presentation by Professor Gerald Meyer on the American Labor Party 1936 to 1954 with a dramatization by Roberto Aragone and Art Bernal. On Saturday, May 9th of last year, the Cornelia Street Cafe hosted the Italian American Writers Association, along with the Vito Marc Antonio Forum, and 2 of the founders of the organization, Stephen Siciliano, who read from his latest novel manuscript, The Good Father, that tells the story of the life of radical Congressman Vito Marc Antonio through the eyes of a neighboring family, and yours truly, Gil Fagiani, who read from his collection of poetry set in East Harlem called A Blanquito en el Barrio. On September 19th of last year, we celebrated Pope Francis's visit to East Harlem and Italian American Culture Month with a people's pilgrimage to East Harlem, starting at Lucky Corner at 116 and Lexington Avenue, which is where Marc Antonio used to end his political campaigns. We walked, and the walk included a visit to Vito Marcantonio's home, Our Lady Queen of Angels Elementary School that Pope Francis eventually visited, and that was the church that was shut down to people's protests in 2007. And the organization is in the process now of appealing to the Vatican to admit they made an error in denying Marc Antonio a burial in the Catholic cemetery. On October 15th of last year at Ostos Community College, we presented a talk, again by Professor Jeremiah, and dramatizations by Lulu Lolo Pasquale and Roberto Dragoni on the theme, Congressman Vito Marc Antonio, Champion of Immigrant Rights. And finally, on October 31st of last year, we sponsored a symposium at this location based on Michael Parenti's memoir, Waiting for Yesterday, Pages from a Street Kid's Life, that included a talk by Stephen Siciliano, readings by Lulu Lolo, and dramatization by Roberto Regano. I'd like to remind people that there are books available today for sale, including Nelson Denis's books. You have some books here. Yeah. Jerry, do you have your book here today?
I do.
Okay, so we also have Jerry's book, Vito Marc Antonio, Radical Politician. And is there also a copy of Vote My Conscience today? Okay. So at this time, I'm going to read my poem, Litany of San Vito, which has become a tradition at all the Vito Marcantonio Forum's functions. Litany of San Vito, to Congressman Vito Marc Antonio. San Vito of East Harlem, pray for us. San Vito, bread of the poor, pray for us. San Vito, crucified by Wall Street, pray for us. San Vito, martyr of McCarthyism, pray for us. From the jail cell walls, San Vito, deliver us. From the backyard crap game, San Vito, deliver us. From the loan shark's vig, San Vito, deliver us. From the drunken stupor, San Vito, deliver us. From TB and asthma, San Vito, protect us. From the social workers' visit, San Vito, protect us. From the immigration raids, San Vito, protect us. From the landlord's greed, San Vito, protect us. So before I ask Nelson Denis to begin his presentation, I'd like to read an excerpt of a review of his book, War Against All Puerto Ricans, that was written.
You know, people just coming in, there's still seats on the front.
Yeah, there's plenty of seats.
Right over there. So.
This is a review, a little snippet of a review by Greg Grandin, a professor of history at NYU. As more than a half a century of failed U.S. policy towards Cuba comes to a slow end, then Nelson Denis's fascinating book is a timely reminder of that other island in the Caribbean that the United States took possession of in 1898. War Against All Puerto Ricans is a remarkable history of a forgotten national liberation movement and Washington's brutal pacification campaign. So, Nelson.
I want to thank Gil for this phenomenal invitation, for making me a part, if only for a day, of your experience and of the opportunity to commemorate the life and times and struggle and achievement of Congressman Vito Marc Antonio. And I'm really proud to be able to just add a page to it, because this is my feeling. It's an opinion. It's just a personal opinion. But it's based on, you know, some experience. I was a state assemblyman in East Harlem for 4 years, for 2 terms, and district leader for a long time, and ran a whole bunch of campaigns. I lost some, I won some, but the point is I got to know a good bit about the political life and history of East Harlem, of El Barrio. And it is my feeling, my strong opinion, that Vito Marc Antonio, as a man and as a political leader, he did more, he sacrificed, he struggled more for the people of Puerto Rico, for the Puerto Rican people of East Harlem, more than any other elected official, city, state, or federal, including the Puerto Rican elected officials of the last 40 or 50 years, including me. And I think that there's a real robust set of facts that bear that out. He was just such a passionate man, and he lived it, he walked it. It wasn't just about empty political posturing, which is what we see a lot these days. We even see it in Puerto Rico from the Puerto Rican government itself, which is actually one of the biggest problems. But I'll take just a few minutes to give a little bit of the Puerto Rican history that's in my book, and then how Vito became a really central part of that. And you'll see that that there was a partnership, there was a unity there that just came from the heart. It wasn't just, oh, I got 10,000 Puerto Ricans, so I got this is something that came from the man himself. But just to walk you through some history from Puerto Rico, in 1898, the United States went in through the Spanish-American War. The very following year, the largest hurricane of that century, devastating, Huracán San Vito, destroyed the entire agriculture. $50 million worth of coffee alone were lost. Tens of thousands of farmers lost their farms. This was a truly devastating hurricane in 1899. The United States sent no meaningful hurricane relief. Instead, the following year, in 1900, they devalued this is their relief. They devalued the currency of the island. The Puerto Rican peso was actually the Spanish peso. That was the currency. The Spanish peso and the American dollar were of roughly equivalent international buying power. So there was an essential parity. But the United States, by legislative fiat, said, well, you're going to have to change it, turn in your Puerto Rican, your Spanish pesos for American dollars. All right, that's reasonable, because now it's the United States. But every Spanish peso is worth 60 American cents. So a 40% devaluation like this, overnight. And if you think about what that would do in our own personal lives, if we wake up tomorrow and we have 40% less money and 40% more debts, and then you multiply that by 8.5 million people in the city, you multiply it by every corporation and everything in America, you could see that this society, this country, would basically, as it's structured now, would cease to exist. There would be riots. Institutions would fall apart overnight. 40%. What happens when the stock market goes down a few points? When the World Trade Center was down, a terrible tragedy. But 2 buildings had repercussions that were global, worldwide. These 2 large buildings. What would happen if the United States suddenly, every person in the United States had 40% less money? Especially where we are in this income distribution, where if you listen to Bernie Sanders and other people, the top 1%, we all know how that's been going for the last 20 years, basically since Reagan. Well, that's what happened in Puerto Rico in the year after the hurricane. That's in 1900. Then in 1901, the United States instituted something called the Hollander Act, which is a steeply graduated set of property taxes levied against the farmers in Puerto Rico that they'd never seen before. So you have this economic trifecta, a hurricane, currency devaluation, a property tax. The net result of which was that farmers were desperate to hold on to their farms. They needed liquidity. They needed cash because it had basically been taken away from them. So they're looking for loans desperately, anything to hold on to their land. The only place they could go was appropriately called the American Colonial Bank. That was the name. You can't make this stuff up. So you go to the American Colonial Bank, but there's no usury law restriction. So they charge any interest they want, and they didn't want the loans repaid because they wanted the collateral. They wanted the land, right? And within 30 years, The land of Puerto Rico, 80% of the arable land in Puerto Rico was owned by North American banking syndicates. And they turned a previously diversified self-sustaining agriculture, coffee, tobacco, fruit, sugar, a diverse agriculture, they turned it into a one-crop cash cow economy, that of sugar. And to show you how quickly they rolled on this, I learned this, I had never heard of this guy. The first civilian governor of Puerto Rico, appointed by President McKinley, the first civilian governor of Puerto Rico was a guy named Charles Herbert Allen. Charles Herbert Allen was one of the quickest governors and one of the most profitable. He only stayed by his own because he quit. 17 months in Puerto Rico. Until Luis Muñoz Marin became the elected governor of Puerto Rico, and there supposedly became a commonwealth, the governors had to give the President of the United States a yearly fiscal report. Sort of like, you give to your shareholders. So he gave a fiscal report to McKinley, which was basically an agricultural soil sample study, because that's what Charles Herbert Allen devoted himself to during his governorship, was to studying the soil and the climate of Puerto Rico. And he appointed 623 US expats into the Puerto Rican government, of his own buddies and friends, whatever, who now became part of the Puerto Rican bureaucracy. So he hands in his first year's fiscal report to President McKinley, and within 2 or 3 weeks, he splits Puerto Rico. He quits, and he runs up to Wall Street, and he becomes a vice president of Morgan Guaranty Trust. And within 10 years, Charles Herbert Allen became treasurer, then president, then chairman of the board of the American Sugar Refining Company, which today is known as Domino Sugar.
That's right.
This man made himself, he was like the first sugar king of Puerto Rico. He was the hit man. You may have, you're familiar with a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, this guy was a really effective hitman, and it was all legal. Well, he goes up, he goes to the president, he hands in his fiscal report, he says, sir, your honor, respectfully, I quit, because I'm going to Wall Street. And when people on Wall Street saw what this man was able to accomplish, because also those 600 plus friends that he appointed into the bureaucracy gave him all sorts of easements, water rights, preferential tax treatments, all sorts of concessions that gave him, and also he had conducted all the soil sample studies, and he had buddies on Wall Street, and he had the street cred of having been the governor of Puerto Rico. You roll all that together, and he was a walking investment, a piggy bank. This man just soaked in the investment and was able to hardwire the Puerto Rican economy, especially through those 600 plus friends that he had that was able to help his company. So when people saw how quickly Charles Herbert Allen became the king of sugar, a whole slew of carpetbaggers started coming down, because this is like a new gold mine. Puerto Rico was originally perceived for its value as a naval coaling station in 1898. Because if you look at it as a landmass, it's the first there's other little islands, but it's the first major landmass that you encounter coming down off of Europe. And it's geopolitically, it's significant because it's neatly positioned between South and North America. Then there's Santo Domingo and Cuba. But when you're coming from here, it was a very significant outpost. So originally that was its value, but Charles Herbert Allen discovered the value of the soil itself. Okay, so now we're in a situation where by 1930, because of Herbert Allen and his type of friends and the people that came down after him, 80% is owned by these North American banking syndicates. They combined it into what was called centrales, sugarcane centrales. And each central had massive holdings. 4 of them alone: Fajardo, Aguirre, East Puerto Rico Sugar, and Guanica. You know your history.
Yeah.
Because tú eres de Ponce.
Yeah.
Guanica was near Ponce. Those 4 alone held half of the land of that 80% that I told you about. So half of 80 is 40%. So 4 corporations, 4 centrales, owned 40% of Puerto Rico's farmland. That's a hectic. That's a really accelerated disappropriation. And so the farmers, people that were previously owning their own land, were now working on the land. But they couldn't even get a proper wage, because in 1917, under what was known as the Jones-Shafroth Act, Puerto Ricans were decreed as citizens of the United States. This was on March 2, 1917. Exactly a month to the day later, on April 2, 1917, Woodrow Wilson sent his declaration of war to the U.S. Congress. We went into war, and 18,000 Puerto Ricans were conscripted into the U.S. Army. So they were made U.S. citizens just in time, 1 month before, and then we go off to war. They come back from war, figuring, you know, all right, well, we've paid our dues, somos ciudadanos, coño. Sorry, you know, I'm sure there's an Italian correlate to that. Anyway, so they come back and they say, okay, you know, at least we were part of this larger republic. Well, they find out there was a series of cases, Supreme Court cases called the Insular cases. One of the most prominent of which was Balzac, B-A-L-Z-A-C, Balzac v. Puerto Rico in 1922, which found that although Puerto Ricans were citizens, due to the territorial and supremacy clauses of the United States Constitution, the Constitution did not fully apply to Puerto Rico because it was a territory. So therefore, all of the privileges and immunities of the US Constitution did not necessarily apply to Puerto Rico. Long story short, what they meant is you ain't entitled to a minimum wage. That's what it came down to. I found in politics that very often, maybe most often, politics is a conflict of interests disguised as a conflict of principles. So they waved the Constitution and all this at Puerto Rico's face, but what it was really about was denying them the minimum wage during the Depression in the 1930s. So these people come back from war, they find out they can't even get a minimum wage, they organize into unions. And speaking of minimum wage, here comes one of my best friends, Herson, who schleps around New York with my books. I appreciate it, Herson. Thank you. Oh man, now I should shut up and go home, because here I am, you know, I'm oppressing my friend Herson.
No, I thought this started at 6,
Yeah.
not at 5, man, so please excuse us.
So no minimum wage. This is where the figure named Albizu Campos comes prominently into this history. Albizu Campos was the first Puerto Rican to graduate from Harvard Law School. Brilliant lawyer, spoke 6 languages, very dedicated. If you imagine in those days what it meant to be the first guy to graduate from Harvard Law School to speak 6 languages. Can we talk, and he was black, he was very dark skinned, but can we talk money? Can we talk United Fruit? I mean, this man could have gone anywhere that he wanted. You know, he could have sold out in so many directions. But what he did to his, and it's a matter of record, he just went back to his hometown of Ponce. He started a one-man law office, and he practiced poverty law, just defending his neighbors. If they couldn't afford it, they would would pay him in kind, pay him a chicken or something. One rule is that he wouldn't defend an outright thief. He might defend someone that maybe robbed the bank, you know, a little, but not someone that robbed from his own brother. But he also was a staunch nationalist. He came back to sow the seed of independence for Puerto Rico. That was his aim. And for many years, he was editorializing, writing, advocating, organizing on behalf of the independence of Puerto Rico. He graduated from Harvard in 1921 from the law school. For 15 years, as you say in Spanish, en su casa lo conocen. They know him in his house. No one in the United States, they didn't bother, yeah, sure, let him talk. But it was when the workers in the sugarcane fields finally realized that they needed to unite and create a union and strike. They had a strike. And they went to Albizu and asked him to lead the strike because their own leaders in San Juan were selling them out, cutting little side deals with the sugarcane companies. They found out that their own leaders, so they went to Albizu. And Albizu Campos led that strike, negotiated it, and the wages doubled from 7.5 cents an hour to $1.50 an hour, which to 15 cents an hour. It became $1.50 a day. It was a 10-hour workday. And that might not sound like a lot today, 15 cents an hour, but in those days it was the difference between starving and not. In the middle of the Great Depression, this was 1934. But for Albizu, it also meant something, a big change in his life. Because once he won that strike, it was a 4-month strike. Wall Street was not expecting it. And also one of the negotiated items of that strike was that Puerto Rico was entitled to any of the income escalators that would come from any subsequent minimum wage legislation. So it put Puerto Rico firmly on the economic map, at least as far as having a minimum wage. But when that happened, Wall Street took notice. And this is during the Great Depression. And Wall Street needs money. We might think otherwise, but Wall Street is very often like the Wizard of Oz. He's a smoke and mirrors and everything. There's a lot of smoke, but it's a little guy that needs money constantly to keep up because it's sort of a little bit of a pyramid scheme. The money coming in, and so I hate to say Ponzi. So Albizu wins this, and the United States responds by changing its relationship to Puerto Rico. They sent in a new governor immediately, and not a legislator, not a financial expert, an army general named Blanton Winship, who had experience in dealing with Native American populations. So you know where that was headed. And they sent in a new police chief, E. Francis Riggs. And between E. Francis Riggs and Blanton Winship, they tripled the size of the police force. They armed them with Tommy guns and riot gear, and they militarized that police force and taught them how to basically treat their own people as a foreign population. And so now the police became a sort of an occupying army. E. Francis Riggs was especially interesting because his father was the owner of the Riggs National Bank, which is the largest bank in Washington, D.C. And if you read another interesting book called The Fish That Ate the Whale, it's published last year by Rick Cohen, The History of United Fruit, Riggs National Bank lent money under the table to people that would go into different South American regimes and stage a fake revolution that was actually a disguised right-wing takeover that would install a tin pot dictator who would then give hundreds of thousands of free acres to the United Fruit Company after he took over. There was a word for that too. The word filibuster originally meant that, to stage a fake revolution, the United Fruit. So anyway, the Riggs Bank was one of the principal financing entities for these revolutions. This is a matter of right, so I recommend that book, Fish That Ate the Whale. So you have this guy, E. Francis Riggs, who is like not only a police chief, he's a colonial overseer for his father's bank, and he's now the police chief. But what they start to do is they start shooting Puerto Ricans, killing nationalists. After shooting 4 of them, killing them, in something known as the Rio Piedras massacre, E. Francis Riggs calls a press conference. He calls the press. He wants the Puerto Ricans to hear it. The people have just been barely laid to rest, but buried, the 4 people that the police murdered. He calls a press conference while the island is still grieving over that to tell the press that if the reason why this happened, because he knew the press would ask, he said, that's simple. If Albizu Campos and the nationalists continue to agitate the sugarcane workers and the university students, there's going to be war to the death against all Puerto Ricans. That's what he said, with the bodies of those Puerto Ricans just in the grave. And I figured that would be a very good title for my book.
Yes, it did.
Because it was declared by the police chief himself. And they weren't kidding, because the following year and a half later, in 1937, on Palm Sunday, 1937, in Ponce, during a peaceful march, with people coming out of church with the palm fronds in their hands, men, women, and children, none of them, all unarmed. They were marching on behalf of independence for Puerto Rico and supporting Albizu Campos, and they even had a permit to be on the street, even though they didn't need one. They had a permit. Well, this police department stood on all sides so that they couldn't escape. They created a killing zone, and they started shooting this Palm Sunday group. And they kept shooting for about 15 minutes until 17 men, women, and children lay dead. Even a little girl, little 9-year-old Georgina Maldonado was shot in the back, dead. And over 200 people were sent very seriously wounded to the hospital. It was known as the Ponce Massacre. So it is within this context that that Vito Marc Antonio comes into this. And I'm sorry I've taken a little while, but I'll. Vito Marc Antonio was one of the greatest, most committed, and most courageous compatriots of the Puerto Rican independence movement. I'll just share a few things from the book. He has been, and not just in my book, in one of my footnotes from a book by John Simon that was published 10 years, monthly review 10 years ago. Vito Marc Antonio was especially popular with his Puerto Rican constituents for his defense of their interests, both in New York City and on the island of Puerto Rico. This included the cause of the Puerto Rican independence. And to amplify, to show you over time how he did this, how he didn't just say, I support independence. The kind of things that Vito Marc Antonio did. One, when Albizu Campos was put to trial. Oh, by the way, Albizu Campos, one of the effects of the sugarcane strike, which was in 1934-35, Within just a few months, they had Albizu Campos up on charges of seditious conspiracy against the United States, even though he had been advocating for independence for 15 years. So the crime, whatever he'd been doing those 15 years, wasn't it. It was the strike. The sugarcane strike is why he was suddenly up on charges. That's the exact language, by the way, that Oscar Rivera is in jail for right now, seditious conspiracy. Right now, I'm engaging in seditious conspiracy against the United States, and you two are all suspect, motherfucker. So you yeah, so check it out. So he's get ready. I always, like Malcolm X, I look to the exits first before coming into a room, man. I'm not comfortable with nothing. Anyway, so okay, exit, you know, like. All right, sorry. So they have this kangaroo trial for Albizu Campos because in the first trial, under the first equal rights and due process clauses of the Constitution, you're supposed to have representative sampling of the jury. Well, they had, you know, about 9 or 10 Puerto Ricans on the jury, which is appropriate because of the population of Puerto Rico. That's what it should be, a demographic sampling. Well, they refused to indict, but the 2 Americans on the jury, so we had a hung jury. So then they impaneled a new jury, and this time they flipped it. Somehow the demographic sampling was 10 Americans and 2 Puerto Ricans, and the 2 Puerto Ricans were employed by the government of Puerto Rico. So when they had, in that second trial, because they figured out there's no way they're going to get Albizu Campos. He hasn't done anything. He just advocated, consistent with the principles of the United States, that all men are created equal, and the government requires the consent of the government. And he just led this strike, and it was legal. All right, so now we have the second trial, and Vito Marc Antonio was set to testify at that trial. He was chartered on a plane. Suddenly, mysteriously, that chartered plane was not available. It was not available for 1 day and 2 days. They kept saying, no, we got another one. Long story short, it had been arranged from some high level that Congressman Vito Marc Antonio was not to appear at that trial before the jury verdict. So they held up. They managed to help, and this is a matter of record. This isn't some paranoid X-Files. This is in historical record. Vito Marc Antonio himself said, they kept me from testifying at that trial. And he was all set to testify on behalf of Albizu Campos as a sitting congressman. So that was one example. Albizu Campos then is found guilty by that second jury. Vito Marc Antonio visited him in Atlanta penitentiary repeatedly. He visited him at least, the record shows, at least 6 times during the time that Albizu was in jail, and other nationalists as well. And he made sure that the warden gave medicine because Albizu Campos, you won't be surprised to know, was severely unattended, and he was allowed to fall sick in Atlanta penitentiary. And Vito Marc Antonio made sure that he was diagnosed and that he received the medicine that he needed. That's what Vito Marc Antonio did that nobody else did. And this was in the mid-30s. When Albizu Campos got out of Atlanta penitentiary, he was still pretty sick. He had to go to what was known as Columbus Hospital, not Columbia, Columbus Hospital here in the United States. And he was there for a number of months, recuperating. One of the nuns found a bug in the hospital room, and this is to me is maybe some of you know him, you know his family, and so I'm only these are the little things that I know. You gotta love this guy. He goes to the hospital room, rips out the bug, starts yelling to it and cursing at J. Edgar Hoover. He starts cursing at J. Edgar Hoover through the bug and telling me he's going to expose him on the floor of U.S. Congress. You gotta love a guy like this. This is my kind of congressman, man. He's yelling at J. Edgar Hoover, who, by the way, there was a carpetas program in Puerto Rico that Hoover started. This was very serious. Over 100,000 secret FBI files were kept on Puerto Ricans. It was known as a carpetas program. By the time they finished, it was 1.8 million pages of secret police surveillance that was monitored and started by the FBI over a period of 5 decades, basically with J. Edgar Hoover. So when Vito talked, he knew what he was talking about because he knew that carpetas program was in place. In addition, I digress a moment. When Albizu Campos got out of jail in 1947, December 47, within a few months, they passed a law in Puerto Rico called Public Law 53. They called it La Ley de la Mordaza, the gag law, because that law made it a felony punishable by 10 years in jail to say a word, whistle a tune, sing a song, anything in favor of the independence of Puerto Rico or against the United States. This included singing the national anthem. If you sang a few bars of La Borinqueña, or if you owned the Puerto Rican flag in your own home, you were violating Law 53 and you could be sent to jail for 10 years. And the FBI could use that against you. So but this was in 47. This one was earlier. But to show you how, how serious this was happening in Puerto Rico. So Vito Marc Antonio yells into the bug, and he rips out the bug. Suffice to say that the bug was not reinstated in the hospital room. Then when Governor Winship continued with his tyranny in Puerto Rico, because Governor Winship was the one that presided over the police force and over the Ponce massacre, the people that I told you. It was Vito Marc Antonio that on the floor of the US Congress denounced Winship, because even though those murders had occurred, it got reported up in the United States as a riot, as a Puerto Rican riot. And in the New York Times called it a gunfight. But there's no gunfight if one side doesn't have guns, right? But this is the newspapers of record. They all reported it in a different way. Because the fact is that what happens in Puerto Rico, in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, but what happened in Puerto Rico didn't happen at all. And to this day, we have this dystopic vision where things happen in Puerto Rico that we don't hear about. Right now, they've closed over 200 schools, and teachers are losing their jobs and pensions, and there's massive demonstrations in Puerto Rico about that. We don't hear about it up here. So anyway, we heard about it through Vito, because he, as a congressman, went on the floor of Congress and denounced Governor Winship as a murderer. I mean, he came out and said it. And you know what happened? The day after his testimony on Congress, Governor Blanton Winship was fired. Roosevelt called him back. And that was the end of Winship. That was because of Vito Marc Antonio. Then Blanton Winship, what he does is, what a snake little guy. He hires himself out as a lobbyist for the sugarcane companies to try to get that minimum wage that the strike had secured, to get it written out of the legislation. Sounds a little like the hedge funds today, quite a bit. So now he goes from being a governor to being a high-priced, this is an army general, suddenly functioning as a sleazy lobbyist in Washington. Vito Marc Antonio denounced him for that. They said, look at what this man is doing. We had to boot him out of Puerto Rico, and now he comes here behind the scenes trying to do the same damn thing. And he exposed it, and the minimum wage law stayed for Puerto Rico because of Vito Marc Antonio. You fast forward a few years later, when they started something that was called Operation Bootstrap for Puerto Rico, which was essentially something we have still to this day. 20-year tax abatement deals where companies don't pay interest, dividend, or capital gains taxes in exchange for bringing a business to Puerto Rico and creating a few jobs. But all the profits are being repatriated back to New York. So you've got these, somewhat relatively low-wage jobs that you're building. You could say that you're doing something for Puerto Rico, but it's really all about creating enormous tax benefits and a very cheap labor pool for these companies. They called it Operation Bootstrap, but Vito Marc Antonio, again, on the floor of Congress, called it Operation Booby Trap. And he gave an example, which was the Caribe Hilton. Caribe Hilton was the first major project under Operation Bootstrap. The way it worked is the government built the hotel, and spend about, in those days, you figure out the math what it is now, but something like a $200,000 ad budget that at the expense of the government for the hotel. In exchange for that, Conrad Hilton comes and he puts the people in it, many, and all the management people for sure were from the United States. And then you got some, they would be serving them their little Mai Tai drinks. The Puerto Ricans would come around and they would have like waiter jobs and the service jobs. So in exchange for that, they give him the Conrad Hilton, they lease it to him, and all he has to do is pay back a little bit, and he doesn't have to pay taxes. They also had a casino in there, and that casino was a sludge fund for Puerto Rican politicians. And so that's how Conrad Hilton was able to, to keep the thing going. So that was like the flagship thing. Vito Marc Antonio exposes it. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to get rid of that was like too big. It was like one of these too big to fail deals, the Hilton in Puerto Rico, so it stayed, but he exposed it. And this was, and this was now in the late 40s, early 50s. And then when he was no longer in Congress, Vito Marc Antonio was a friend to the Nationalist Party, to Albizu Campos, and to Gilberto Concepcion de Gracia, who was the person that followed Albizu Campos in maintaining the Nationalist Party in Puerto Rico. So there's a long history here of involvement on the part of Vito Marc Antonio. He was much beloved in East Harlem. And the fact that it's called the Lucky Corner is because he's the one that would bring the good luck. It's also known as UCLA, because apparently some of the times that's the only place where you would learn anything was from Vito Marc Antonio on 106th Street. UCLA is the University of the corner of Lexington Avenue. And I believe that Vito Marc Antonio founded it. And so I'm very proud to be here today to share some of the little knowledge that I have, to acknowledge how deeply involved this man was in the history of Puerto Rico and how deeply he had them in his heart. He was a really great man, and he's the kind of man that we need today, you know. And so I don't plan on getting all choked up, but I gotta tell you, the people like this don't come along very often, who devote their life, their career, everything they have for their principles. And I'm proud to be here and say the name of Vito Marc Antonio.
Yes, sir.
Okay, there will be a Q&A part of the program later. So next up, we have Roberto Ragone, who will do some dramatizations of Marcantonio's congressional speeches. Roberto is a founding member of the Vito Marcantonio Forum, as well as a co-chair. He has over 25 years' experience in government and nonprofits, working in education, criminal justice, arts, and culture. As a consultant, he now focuses on marketing, public relations, and strategic planning for businesses, nonprofits, and arts-related projects.
Thank you. You know, thank you. You know, I usually, whenever we're at the library, I usually feel like I need to practice a little bit before I come up, you know, while the other speakers are speaking. But your conversation, this presentation was so fascinating. I just couldn't even look at the page to practice. So, I'd like to. I'm going to do two dramatizations, right? So when the hat is on, I'm Vito Marc Antonio. When the hat is off, I'm Roberto Ragone. The first dramatization is from December 18th, 1947. Now, 1947 is an interesting year because three things are happening. One, the press is putting out the question of whether Vito Marc Antonio had something to do with the murder of Joseph Scottariggio, a Republican pollster, that a campaigner that was trying to get him defeated.
70th anniversary.
Right, and it's coming up, right? And then that year was also the year of the Wilson-Pakula Act, which passes, where that would require Vito Marc Antonio to have to get the party boss from the other political parties to accept him on their ticket to run for office, because up until then he was able to run as a Democrat, Republican, as well as his own American Labor Party. And that restriction sets the stage for him having to run in 1948 only on the American Labor Party. And the third thing that's happening in 1947 is basically people are looking around New York City and going, I'm being very colloquial and casual here, where are all these Puerto Ricans coming from? Where are all these Puerto Ricans coming from, right? And the accusation is, well, Vito Marc Antonio is bringing all the Puerto Ricans to New York, quote unquote, right? So the speech from December 18th, 1947 is Vito Marc Antonio's way of addressing that propaganda, both in terms of Puerto Ricans in New York City and Puerto Rico. Okay, here we go. My friends, the newspapers and magazines of nationwide circulation have printed a great deal about the alleged problem of Puerto Rican migration. Instead of giving you the facts, you have been given a distorted picture. The stories on Puerto Rican migration is some more evidence that the press of our nation is as free as its few owners permit it to be. Our much vaunted freedom of the press is in reality freedom for those who own the press to do and say what they please, and to refuse to permit the same space to those whom they unjustly attack. Now, I know that people of Puerto Rican origin have attempted to tell their side. Have you seen their side printed anywhere? I haven't, and I have followed the subject very closely. The press has not told you that Puerto Ricans are American citizens by an act of Congress adopted in 1917, and that they have a perfect right to come to New York City to live, to work, and to be treated with absolute equality. The press has not told you that the island of Puerto Rico is a colony, and that its 2 million people have been treated as colonial since the United States took possession in 1898. The press has not told you that Puerto Rico in 1898 had an agriculture of its own that afforded its people a fairly decent standard of living. Today, 70% of the good land in Puerto Rico is owned by 4 large sugar corporations. They are absentee corporations who have been taking out of Puerto Rico millions and millions of dollars annually in profit. Worse than that, they have turned Puerto Rico into a one-crop, cash crop, diabetic economy. Because of their ownership of the land, Puerto Rico cannot have a diversified crop and raise food for its own people. This means that the people are employed only 3 months of the year, the harvest season of the sugar plantations. When the harvest season is over, there is nothing to do, so that the Puerto Rican is forced to live on an income of about $300 a year. Now, you may say, why doesn't the Puerto Rican get a job in industry after and before the harvest period? Again, the press has not told you that the Puerto Rican has been unable to develop any industries. And why? Again, the press has not told you that whenever attempts to build an industry are made by the Puerto Ricans, industries up here go down there and dump at cutthroat prices. This has happened time and time again. Is it any wonder that the Puerto Rican cannot find work in his own native land? Is it any wonder that he and his children are underfed? All this, the press, of course, has never told you. The press has not told you that in Puerto Rico the people have to pay 30% more for anything that we purchase in New York. Why? Because Puerto Rico must buy from the United States Congress, from the United States. Congress passed laws preventing Puerto Rico from purchasing from other countries at cheaper prices. The press has not told you that only United States ships can carry goods to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has been subjected to a shipping monopoly, adding to the cost of its existence. Now, why doesn't the government of Puerto Rico do something about it? Why don't the people of Puerto Rico pass laws to protect their industries against dumping? Why doesn't the government of Puerto Rico use ships of other nations to break the monopoly? Why doesn't the government of Puerto Rico pass a law to exempt it from the Tariff Act so it may purchase cheaply from other countries? You have a right to ask these questions because the press has not told you why. The press has not told you that Puerto Rico has no sovereignty. It has no power to make any laws with respect to tariffs, to protect its industries against shipping monopolies, and it cannot, for all practical purposes, enforce any laws that will liberate it from the tyranny of its present one-crop agriculture. It cannot legislate over basic matters of life and death. Puerto Rico's economic plight, which is the main cause of the migration to the United States, cannot be resolved until Puerto Rico is granted sovereignty. Puerto Rico can never have the sovereignty that it needs to resolve her economic problems until Puerto Rico is given her full independence. It has been stated that Puerto Rico would starve if given independence. I can hardly conceive how it can starve any worse than now. What is more, only with independence and a favorable reciprocal trade treaty, which we have given to other countries, can Puerto Rico protect its own industries against dumping, protect its people against the tariff, and develop an economy which will produce food for the people of Puerto Rico. This, again, the press has not told you. And why the truth would expose what a cruel Wall Street imperialism has caused in Puerto Rico. This is the old story. The same campaign against the Puerto Ricans were carried on against the Irish when they first came here, the Jews, the Poles, the Italians. It is always the game of those whose only interest in this nation is profit and more profit that forced the newly arrived into a cheap labor market. Is this the only answer that our democracy can give to these newly arrived? Thank you. Thank you. All right, and now the second speech. Jerry had asked whether I could give a speech that incorporates something about Vito Campos, right? And so what's interesting is that I take a speech that's primarily October 19th, 1949, and I incorporate something from 1937 that makes it, so I make it sound like he's reflecting back on a speech from 1937. And then, what's interesting is the last paragraph is from 1950. And what's interesting to me is that in 1950, which is the last year that Marc Antonio was in office before all the political parties gang up on him to defeat him, I had, read a lot of speeches from My Vote, My Conscience, and there's a lot of, sort of like he's like the Cassandra, he's like the soothsayer, he's predicting the future about the way we're treating Europe. And then because he votes against the Korean War, he's got a lot to say about the Asian continent, right? But in researching for this speech, he does I do find out something in 1950 where he has something to say about Latin America in the broader context in which he puts Puerto Rico. So without further ado, all right, I'll be right back. Mr. Speaker, again and again over the many years that I've been a member of this House, I have taken the floor to plead the cause of the people of Puerto Rico. They are a fine and noble people who, for the past 50 years of occupation of their land by the United States, have suffered a mounting toll of disease and poverty. They are a proud people who, as American citizens, in moving to the mainland in a desperate effort to better themselves, have found nothing but slums, discrimination, and low-paid jobs as their lot in our cities. They are people whose treatment every day gives the lie to the fine talk of our delegates to the United Nations. Talk of the dignity of the human person and of the equality of opportunity. The Puerto Rican people know nothing of these fine things in their lives as they read of our delegates to the UN arguing fervently for human rights for men everywhere. They have but to look at themselves and their children, at the disgraceful hovels in which they are crowded, at the walls of discrimination surrounding them, to dismiss all such talk by their own UN representatives as the sheerest hypocrisy. As I have said again and again, and as I repeat here today, that there can never be a solution to the economic difficulties of Puerto Rico, the root of every ill suffered by the Puerto Rican people, until independence is granted to them. So long as Puerto Rico remains a colonial appendage of the United States, an exploited one-crop sugar economy, it will continue to wallow in disease and poverty. We have heard through the fancy, high-paid advertising a great deal about Operation Bootstrap. But to the people of Puerto Rico, the Munoz Marin administration can be called Operation Booby Trap for the people of Puerto Rico. The government policy to attack industries to Puerto Rico is based on the principle of constructing the plans for the firms to go into Puerto Rico and to equip them. Then the firms are tax exempt for a period of 12 years. These firms, like Textron, want to guarantee that the minimum salary will not be raised, so that these firms expect to do business on the basis of paying starvation wages to the workers of Puerto Rico. Textron recently said if the minimum wage is increased from 25 cents an hour, which they are paying now, they will move from Puerto Rico. While Munoz Marin is engaged on Operation Booby Trap, for the people of Puerto Rico, let us see what is happening to the people themselves. The cost of living in Puerto Rico has gone up about 300% over the past 9 years since 1940, while salaries and wages have had only slight increases and are now going down. The huge amounts of money which entered the Puerto Rican treasury were because of the revenue on rum and the high taxes collected from the people of Puerto Rico. I would like here to note that in Congress, I protected the income from the rum for the treasury of Puerto Rico. Yes, the Munoz Marin rule is indeed Operation Booby Trap. But I could go on and recite many more phrases of the exploitation of the people of Puerto Rico. I shall from time to time recite more chapters from the story of this sordid saturnalia of corruption and graft which now exist under Mr. Munoz Marin, our Nero of Fortaleza, the puppet of our colonialism. There can only be a resolution to these problems by the Puerto Rican people themselves, working energetically and purposefully in their own interests and their own sovereign independent land. Despite this fact, despite the increasing conviction among the Puerto Rican people that only through independence can they ever hope to build decent lives for themselves and their children, the pro-independence Nationalist Party is daily harassed and terrorized by the police and the territorial government of the island. And the leader of that pro-independence Nationalist Party, Pedro Albizu Campos, is hounded like a common criminal. A little over 10 years before, in 1937, Governor Blanton Winship, the governor of Puerto Rico appointed by the U.S., tried to cover up the Ponce massacre by filing a mendacious report. However, there were photographs that were brought to President Roosevelt's Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, by a committee consisting, among others, of former Congressman Bernard of Minnesota and myself, photographs of children shot in the back and of police wantonly firing on unarmed people from 4 sides could not be ignored. And what did the tyrant do? Instead of seizing the terror, he continued it and immediately had arrested friends of people who had been killed on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. 2 trials were held. The first trial resulted in a mistrial, and in the second trial the defendants were acquitted. But in the meantime, the reign of terror continued. While the victims of the Ponce massacre were being tried for murder, the police forces were given a free hand to continue the orgy of actual murder. A frame-up a la Lorenzo Medici, like in Renaissance Florence, was something at which Mr. Winship would not stop. Dr. Pedro Albizu Campos, a Harvard graduate and the leader of the National, together with several of his followers, were indicted under a post-Civil War statute of conspiracy to insurrect against the government of the United States. They were framed at the governor's palace. Mr. Rockwell Kent, a famous American artist, describes what took place at a cocktail party at the governor's palace immediately after the first trial. And I can quote from his letter to the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1937, which discusses witnessing a conversation in which a piece of paper is removed from an envelope with a list of pre-selected names of people to serve on a jury for a retrial to convict Dr. Albizu Campos. The trial took place, and by a prejudiced jury, by jurors who had expressed publicly bias and hatred for the defendants. Campos and his colleagues were railroaded to jail. Now, Mr. Speaker, those innocent men languished in an Atlanta penitentiary because they were convicted by a fixed jury, a jury representing the economic interests of Wall Street in Puerto Rico. They did the bidding of Governor Blanton Winship. In 1947, Dr. Albizu Campos returned to his home after 10 years of exile in the United States. And to the eternal disgrace of our country, which itself was born out of a bitter struggle for independence that today still honors as its greatest heroes those men who led the struggle, This leader of Puerto Rican independence spent 6 years of his exile in a penitentiary in the United States. Today he lives in San Juan under the type of police surveillance and intimidation that could only have been duplicated in Hitler's Germany. The home of Pedro Albizu Campos is surrounded day and night by police patrols, police cars with jeeps with mounted machine guns. When Dr. Albizu Campos walks along the streets of San Juan, he is closely followed by 4 or 5 plainclothesmen on foot and a load of fully armed policemen in a car a few paces behind. Every shop he enters, every person to whom he talks, is subsequently visited by a representative of the police department. A reign of terror descends on the luckless citizens of Puerto Rico who spend a few minutes talking to Dr. Albizu Campos. When the Nationalist Party leader leaves San Juan to attend a meeting or to make a speech, his car is trailed through the countryside by an armed column of police cars and jeeps. Every hotel or home in which he stays is immediately surrounded by a cordon of police. Every meeting of the Nationalist Party takes place behind police lines. The Nationalist Party is a legal party in Puerto Rico. Its leader is an American citizen, supposedly enjoying all the rights and liberties of any other American citizen. Yet, both he and his party are harassed and intimidated at every turn. This absolutely unjustified and inexcusable conduct upon the part of the police and the higher authorities of Puerto Rico must stop at once. This is still a government of laws and not of men. We have laws to protect us and to punish evildoers. We need no Gestapo in the United States. The situation which I have described here is outrageous, is an outrageous example of police intimidation. This House should take notice of what is happening in Puerto Rico and should see to it that the territorial government and the territorial police are put on notice to cease these activities at once. The development in Puerto Rico, like similar actions we have seen in other countries in Latin America during the past year, are clearly the result of United States pressure. In Cuba, in Chile, in Peru, in Brazil, and also in Puerto Rico, the crackdown against progressive forces, against trade union leaders, against every possible group which speaks for the downtrodden people, has developed, even as the people in power in these areas have drawn closer to the United States. It is a sad realization that is forced upon the people of these countries that today, everywhere the United States pushes its hand, there the ordinary man feels the increased weight of oppression, while the man of privilege and wealth becomes more powerful.
Yes, sir.
You don't get off that easy. Encore! Come back into another one.
Okay, so before we move on to comments and questions, I want to mention that the Vito Marc Antonio Forum is going to have another event at this locale on Wednesday, May 18th. It's another in our Vito Marc Antonio Forum author series. And this book is called Italian Immigrant Radical Culture, the Idealism of the Sovrasivi in the United States, 1890 to 1940, by Marcella Benciveni. And as part of this event, it'll include an Italian and English bilingual reading of Arturo Giovanni's poetry, a union leader, socialist, political activist, and poet. Okay, so having said that, yes, Gerald.
Hi. Well, hi, I'm Gerald Meyer, and thank you. This is a wonderful meeting. Thank you very much. and I'm the co-chair with Roberto. It's sort of like the odd couple, you know? But I'm the one that says, it's not spaghetti, it's linguine. But it's been wonderful. But we do have the most talented group of people, you know, I can't tell you, that do dramatizations and websites and videos and poetry and write articles and organize, and also an artist. Now, Porta Rita Rivera Baracos is our official artist, but she's from Queens. So she has trouble on the, you know, there was, I think, 3 trains, 2 buses, and the ferry, somehow. So this arrived late. But I want to put this up with our other icons over here, because as you can see, this one is in Italian. And we only had Spanish and English, and we were kind of getting nervous. We're getting antsy. So we repaired that, you know, that omission. So one out of, if you put that there, it'd be very good. And then, if I could, on behalf of Vito Marc Antonio Forum, I'd like you to present you with my biography of Marc Antonio.
Did you sign it?
You know, also, Nelson, if you would, we'd love to have you as an honorary member of the Vito Marc Antonio Forum. We feel very close, all of us here, I'm sure. Anyone that's interested in working with us, we really could use help, obviously, you know. We do around 6 events a year. And some are larger, some are smaller. We have an annual commemoration for Marc Antonio, either at the Woodlawn Cemetery. He was denied a Catholic burial, you know, it's incredible. And so, but it's he's near LaGuardia in the non-denominational cemetery, you know. And or in East Harlem. This year we did it with a kind of a walking tour. Wonderful. So we do that, and we have larger meetings, smaller meetings, and book presentations, and people have their own projects. So if we really could use help, and we would really invite you, please invite you. We don't meet that often. We meet
2 or 3 times.
so not very often. It's like less than once a month. So, and we always have, you know, something to eat and very nice group of people. So we invite you to join us. Last but not least, it's so rich what you had to say, Nelson. It's just the specificity was wonderful. I hadn't seen these cause and effect so clearly. I mean, you know, by putting this into history is so critical. You know, the dates, you know, when the Jones Act. I never got that before, and I also, you know, the exchange of the money, you know, is remarkable. You know, how to defraud Puerto Rico from birth on, you know, to this completely unfair relationship that exists. I really wish you very, very well with the book. I'd like to encourage people, certainly everyone's going to buy a book, but please also think about reviewing the book. You're going to read the book, write a review, have it placed somewhere. There are plenty of places. I have ideas that perhaps I could share and other people do. And so when you're reading the book, write a review. Don't think, oh, I never did it before. Da, da. If you need a little help, there are people can always, you know, can always work with you, and put it out there, because we are fighting a very powerful enemy, but we can't just complain and get conspiratorial and paranoid. All of that paralyzes people. It just paralyzes them. We have to be proactive, put out our energy to work and do things, and use the power that we have. But this is a very powerful weapon that you've created for the progressive community. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm inviting people to make comments on what you heard tonight or ask questions. I think I saw somebody over here first. Okay, maybe I did. Yes.
What is the state of Puerto Rico now? I mean, is it still the same dynamic that you were speaking about?
That's a good question. First, I want to acknowledge the the tremendous, the virtuosity of what Roberto Ragoni did I haven't seen live presentations of Vito Marc Antonio, but it seems to me like maybe even with members here, and maybe you know a lot about it, it looks to me like someone could do a Broadway show about the life of Vito Marc Antonio.
Talking about that.
Yeah, man, I mean, right? I think, we're doing Hamilton, and this is it's a perfect story with so many, and at this point in time in our history. And so I want to just recognize again and thank you for. I also noticed that some of the substance of what you covered really amplified and enriched some of the themes that I talked about. I mean, you could see that, it's very real. We're all touching different parts of that same elephant. So thanks.
I was gonna say that what we did is almost like ideal learning, because you said something in one presentation and I kind of dramatized it. It's like you're reinforcing knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, and the fact that some of what he did, he was doing it, if you think of where it happened, on the floor of U.S. Congress, with the press and all these people and all the forces that are arrayed against him, it gives you a sense of the lion kind of courage that this guy had. So, thanks. Your question is a really very vital, because we're in a situation right now where there's two bills in Congress. There's one from Orrin Hatch's committee and one from the Natural Resources in the Senate, the House Committee on Natural Resources, a companion bill. They're now probably going to go into joint conference committee to create a fiscal control board for Puerto Rico, which is basically going to be a collection agency for the hedge funds. And these hedge funds have bought in at very low prices, most of them, and they're maybe in the area of 30 cents or a little more on the dollar, but then they're insisting on a whole dollar's worth of return. Knowing full well that Puerto Rico doesn't qualify now for Chapter 9 bankruptcy restructuring because they were written out of the code in 1984. The litigants themselves that are fighting this in court, and the judges, everyone, when asked why was Puerto Rico written out in 1984, everyone admits they can't figure it out. There's no policy, policy reason. In other words, nothing that makes sense, but there is one that makes sense. There is. And as a former politician, it comes to me instinctively. The bill passed in June 29, 1984. That was roughly around where we are now, right now, in a presidential election year. And it was the presidential re-election of Ronald Reagan. So in the middle of the Reagan era, you have lobbyists who approached the Reagan administration and said, we can, and so to catch a crook, follow the money. Who benefits from this? Well, these creditors, these bondholders, and it is very, very propitious because these are triple tax exempt bonds. Puerto Rico is the only one that no state can do it because the states can't issue triple tax exempt bonds. Only Puerto Rico can. And the net yield on those bonds, because of the tax exemption element, is roughly 18 to 20% per year. That's what it's been, and that's why it's been like fiscal crack. Wall Street loves it, and they know that once Puerto Rico was written out of it, it's very difficult for Puerto Rico to be grandfathered back into the Chapter 9. And it's for this reason. The municipal bond market is $3.7 trillion a year. That's what it is. Almost every year, right around there, 3.7. The gross domestic product of the United States is 18 trillion dollars a year. So if you do the math, divide 3.7 into 17, that's about 22%. So in any given year, 22% of the American economy is filtering through these financial instruments, these municipal bonds. And if Puerto Rico were extended this Chapter 9 access, then 50 states would demand some comparable leniency in the restructuring of their own debt. So suddenly you have the entire municipal bond market restructuring and imploding. And that's 22% of the American economy. In other words, it's like, quote unquote, too big to fail. So we're in an area where Obama is not, he's thinking of his legacy. At the same time he's opening up Cuba and Obamacare and all the rest, he's not going to implode Wall Street with 22% of the American economy. So what he does is just point the fingers like Houdini. You point the finger, but the hand is quicker than the eye. He points the finger at Congress and says, Congress must give access to Puerto Rico to Chapter 9. He says it. That's what he said. But that's the totality of his program. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't activate the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, do anything internally to provide some relief. He just points the finger, right? You might as well put, with a dog, you point the finger and he looks at your finger and he can't figure. You might as well, because that's all he's doing, because he knows that Congress isn't going to do it either. Let alone the fact that under Citizens United, these hedge funds are giving money over the table and under the table to all these legislators to make sure that HR 870, the Chapter 9 restructuring bill that Puerto Rico has tried to push, there's something called HR 870, which would amend the Chapter 9 bill to allow Puerto Rico to qualify for it. But that's not going to go anywhere. And not merely because the hedge funds are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in, basically they call it, lobbying, but it's bribing. But because Wall Street, they're not going to upset 22%, of the American economy. So where does this put us? Where does this put? And that's where I'm going, because it's a Gordian knot. And how tight is this Gordian knot? And you reflected it, Roberto, in your speech about the Jones Act, because there's a Jones-Shafroth Act, which was 1917 that gave the citizenship, and then there's something else called the Jones Act in 1920, which is Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act. Under the Jones Act, what you were talking about shipping, it's really, I'm sorry if I'm going at length, but it's a really interesting piece. They created that to protect naval shipping lanes right after World War I, and so it had some purpose then. But for Puerto Rico, that purpose is no longer served. What the Jones Act does in Puerto Rico is it makes it illegal for anything, for a foreign registry vessel to come into Puerto Rico with any foreign goods. It can only do it in one of two ways. If it comes directly into Puerto Rico, it has to pay fees, duties, tariffs, taxes, a whole schedule of costs. That money goes to the merchant marine. But then the cost of that money paid gets passed on to every product: food, cars, clothes, oil. The entire electrical grid of Puerto Rico is run on oil. It's kind of ancient, but unfortunately all the electricity in Puerto Rico comes from oil that has to be imported into the island. So all of this then either comes one of two ways. It comes the way that I just said, directly, or it goes to Jacksonville, Florida, specifically Jacksonville, Florida, where all the goods in that boat has to be offloaded off the original foreign registry vessel and then reloaded onto an American boat, and then it can come into Puerto Rico. Forgive me, I know this is the Vito Marc Antonio Society, but Vito Corleone would have loved that business. You can't get better than that. It's like you just got it's like digging a ditch to fill it again, and then you pay me. It's like a protection racket, and it creates 30 to 50,000 maritime jobs in Jacksonville, Florida, that belong in Puerto Rico.
That's right.
And the net result of that is not merely that this money is going, that is costing more, and they have the shipping. What it does is that, therefore, it means that every product that comes into Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico is an island, so it has to import just about everything. And as you mentioned now, even as agriculture, it gets shipped out, and then it gets shipped back in. So Puerto Rico has been put into an utterly dependent capacity as an importer of everything. So everything it imports it now costs more. It does one big thing for the United States. Since all those products are coming in either from Jacksonville or here, and they're all costing up to 15 to 20% more, it allows U.S. corporations to slightly underbid on all those products, slightly. And Puerto Ricans are very price sensitive because their per capita income is about $16,000 a year, which is less than half that of Mississippi, the poorest state in the United States. So they're so price sensitive, Puerto Ricans, that if they can save a few pennies on something, they will. They have to. So the United States corporations just slightly underbid all those foreign goods. And so what they're creating is like a monopoly for U.S. goods. It's because it's perfectly protected. And it is for that reason that 85% of all the goods purchased in Puerto Rico are from U.S. corporations. It is for that reason that Puerto Rico is the 4th largest market for U.S. goods in the world. This tiny island of 3.5 million people. It's for that reason that there's more Walgreens and Walmarts per square mile in Puerto Rico than anywhere else on the planet. So they've created, as you said, a dumping ground for United States product. And this is all coming from one law, the Jones Act. It's been calculated that the cost of Puerto Rico per year of that Jones Act since 1920, that's 96 years, is about $5 billion a year. If you do the math, 5 times 96 is, I think, $480 billion. You could have paid this public debt of Puerto Rico, $72 to $73 billion. You could have paid that debt 6 or 7 times if it weren't for that one dysfunctional, immoral law that's been ruling over Puerto Rico for nearly a century. But this is why it's a Gordian knot, because to change it, to get rid of that, you're going to have to, all those corporations that are getting all that extra profits, they're going to oppose that. The carrier companies, Seastar, Crowley, Trailways, Horizon, the companies that do the shipping out of Jacksonville, they're gonna oppose it, they'll lobby their Republican congressmen. The unions in Jacksonville, Teamsters, Longshoremen's, or whatever other unions, they'll lobby their unions, their Democratic congressmen. So you're gonna have this dense knot of opposition to changing the Jones Act, which is illegal and well, it's legal, but it's immoral, it's dysfunctional. So it seems to me that you have this Gordian knot that you gotta be like Alexander, you come in and just chop it. And that means independence for Puerto Rico. That's my response.
Yes, for an economic update on the situation, see, there's an excellent article regarding what you're talking about, today's business section of the New
Can you
York
talk
Times.
louder?
Regarding the situation that you're discussing, there's an excellent article in the business section of today's New York Times about Puerto Rico restructuring their debt.
Yeah, but can I just say, and I appreciate that, but Mary Ellen Walsh and Corkery and the sort of the small group of reporters on the New York Times reminds me of the reporters back in the day in 1930s. Back in the 30s, the only news that got out of Puerto Rico, there was no television, radio was coming in. It was basically half a dozen AP and UPI wire service reporters that were reporting things like a riot when people got massacred in Puerto Rico. They were just regurgitating prepackaged news that was coming from La Fortaleza. Now, the New York Times, yeah, they'll come out with it, but do they look at that article? I haven't read it yet, but I'm willing to, right now, put down I'll bet you $5 or $10 they don't talk about the Jones Act. I bet you they don't talk about the underlying economic roots, the failure to allow Puerto Rico to develop any indigenous industry, entrepreneurial class, capital of its own. And so therefore what is constantly being diagnosed is a patient that hasn't really been allowed any access to medicine. Because it's the equivalent of giving them two aspirin to go back in the morning and make sure you pay me the doctor's bill. That's all it's a very superficial analysis. So they'll talk about debt restructuring and the Financial Control Board and possibly allowing the Financial Control Board to extend some kind of debt relief. But even if this would be considered a radical and generous result. We are going to bail out Puerto Rico. Not only we'll give them bankruptcy, but we'll forgive that debt, that $73 billion debt. You can't get better than that? Yes, you can. Because even if you did that, within 5 or 10 years, Puerto Rico's going to be in the same boat. Because it's no accident that government is the largest employer on the island. Because there's no private sector. There's no real inherent economy. All the economic development in Puerto Rico has always been these corporations that get these 20-year tax abatements, and then when the abatements expire, they leave. So Puerto Rico has been in a continuing cycle of dependency on the United States, and until they break that, Puerto Rico is always going to be in this boat. And so that's why I haven't read it, but I'm glad Puerto Rico in this year has collectively gotten more attention than it has in the last 50 from the United States. But the results, some of these articles should be written by journalists from Puerto Rico, because what you're getting is New York Times guys who very, very well regarded and very celebrated, but they don't know Puerto Rico. They don't know Puerto Rican history. They're in a sense, they're almost copying and pasting each other's news, and we have to get deeper than that.
Okay. So I would like to make a statement to that, because part of what people don't know is that the United States gives aid to the Puerto Rican people, and one of the biggest aids is food stamps. My friends, there is hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that go into food stamps, and in Puerto Rico, it's treated like another currency. Okay. And the reason for that is because the only products on the shelves of all the supermarkets are American. So they price them at like what I call the general market prices, which is 30% even above New York, okay? And then, because they get these food stamps, what they're really getting is this amazing welfare from the federal government, which buttresses what he's saying. It even enhances the dependency even more.
Let me just add one quick slice to that. Think about the underlying dynamic there. So it's the American taxpayer that's getting socked for those food stamps, right? And so that goes, it becomes a transfer payment to the United States. And then that money
Huge amount.
from the taxpayer filters up to the corporations that are charging 15 to 20% extra. So it filters up to this 1% of these people that own these corporations. So it's yet another situation where it's not really Puerto Ricans versus the U.S. taxpayer, it's poor versus rich. It's a class struggle. And that's...
We only have 10 minutes left. Okay, so you wanted to ask a question or
Yes.
say something?
Yes, both. It's a fabulous book. I gotta thank Jerry for forcing me to read it within a time frame. And it's available in most of the Brooklyn Public Libraries if you have no money. The first chapter reads like a movie, and the chapter on Vidal stands with any revolutionary resistance literature there is. 2 questions. Knowing the nefarious role played by the U.S. Catholic Church vis-a-vis the lifting of the embargo during the Spanish Civil War, what did the church say in America about all these massacres taking place on a population that was indeed Catholic? And second, you downplayed the role of women. Lolita got 2 sentences, La Madre. Blanca Canales, Ruth Reynolds. Is there a reason for that?
Okay, the first, the Catholic Church, that as far as I could see in my research, they didn't respond because they were in the same conundrum as everyone else. They were receiving news from half a dozen, a few wire service reporters were reporting all the news off of Puerto Rico in the 30s, the 40s, and even the 50s. To get an example of how dysfunctional it was, in 1948, when they passed this bill that I said, Law 53, which made it a felony punishable by 10 years, to say one word against the United States, to even own the flag, that was in 1948. It was in 1948 that George Orwell published his novel, 1984. So in the same year that the United States American public is reading and embracing, and the term Big Brother, it came from 1984, and becoming aware of the tyranny of a government that's looking into every nook and cranny and every part of you. Here in the United States, people turned that book into a bestseller, and in England. At the same time that George Orwell was alive and well in Puerto Rico, because they just passed that law. But people here weren't aware of it. They simply weren't aware. So the Catholic Church, unless they had organs of communication and insight of Puerto Rico and chose not to share it, which may be the case, but the American public didn't hear. I'll give you one more example. When one of the culminating events in this is the revolution that Albizu Campos started in October 1950, and we don't have much time, so I won't. But one of the components of that was 2 men, Oscar Collazo y Griselio Torresola, went to Washington and they tried to kill Harry Truman, who was asleep in his underwear in his Blair House. And the next day, it got written up, these 2 men, Puerto Ricans, as terrorists, communists, lunatics, fanatics, all these things. But the one thing that didn't get mentioned in the American press is that these 2 men were from the town of Jayuya. And that everything that they knew, their families, friends, their neighbors, their childhood, everything they knew was in their hometown of Jayuya. And 24 hours before those men had gone to Washington with their guns on, it was sort of a suicide mission, the town of Jayuya had been bombed by the United States by 10 P-47 Thunderbolt planes, in order to put down this rebellion. So if you're going to compare the violence and who's the terrorist, they just bombed your whole town with ordnance, with aerial bombardment, and 2 men going to Washington D.C. And they did it before, a day before. So, but that didn't get reported.
Actually, it was the only instance of the United States bombing its own territory.
It was one of the one time in America they've done it, but not during a wartime, during a non-wartime civilian population with aerial bombardment sanctioned by the military. So, but we didn't hear that. Now, as far as the second question, I am sorry, I didn't mean to. No, it wasn't intentional on my part. And Blanca Canales, in the part of she is from Jayuya. She led and so that's in.
Successful.
Yeah, and so that is covered in the book, and great. Lolita, no, more than that. No, more than that. there's about 3 pages on Ayuya. Take a look, take a
I'm
look.
blind.
Now, and I'm Blanca Canales. Lolita Lebron this book basically, the story ends in 1950 of this book. So we didn't talk about, that was something that happened 4 years, it was beyond the time frame of this book. But I will say this, that we need to, it's not just at the high points of, when there's these things happen and Lolita takes the floor from Blanca, it's what happens every day. Women are the mothers of these men. It's like, kind of like in West Side Story where Bernardo, they go off and they have the gang fights and everything, but then they come back sick or wounded or dead. And very often it's the women that have to hold these families together. It's the women that get stuck with the tragedy. The men go off and fight and they'll do all their glorious things, but the very much the unsung heroes. And also one thing that Albizu Campos recognized, that the women were often very much more able to keep their mouth shut than the men, because the men sometimes would start drinking rum and play dominoes, and who needs the FBI? They're telling everything here, after a few drinks. So the women were, very much a part of that. I recommend the book by Migny, and it's in a lot of the footnotes here. Migny Sejo Bruno was the insurrection of 1950, and it talks very amply about all the people, including Blanca Canales. So definitely they were a very important part of this, and forgive me if they weren't more prominent, but I just basically have to end the book at 1950.
Okay, we're going to have to end the program now. I just got the signal from the library, and it's almost a quarter on.
Say, where to get the book online? So the people who are watching the video, where do you get the book online?
You can get it on Amazon, and actually there's a very big discount on Amazon. So this is actually a good time to get it. It's been a bestseller on Amazon, and in Puerto Rico you can get it at El Cardil, at Costco.
Well, there are books here today, and there are other people here that have books for sale too. Let's have one last round of applause for